Hello, everyone. I am going to do a close reading and commentary of Jung's Ion. This is volume 3, part 2. And we're just going to read the first part, Ego. So Carl Jung is a Swiss psychiatrist who was born 1875 and died 1961. He was about 19 years younger than Freud. Freud and Jung had sort of an intense but short-lived friendship. They sort of made a break because Freud was kind of attached to his idea of like being a father figure that might be sort of destroyed or attacked by like Jung, who was played the son, but he was also kind of, I don't know, a bit tyrannical in a sense about his ideas and about Jung having to align with those ideas, and Jung just really wasn't having it. They met in 1907 when Jung was about 32 and Freud, let me do the math, was 51, and they basically broke in 1913. So the ego, just that title is really interesting, and that's why I mentioned Freud, because most people, when they think about ego, think of Freud and the id, the ego, and the superego, the ego being the rational part, trying to have a conversation or reconcile like the moral constraints of the superego with the instinctual id. And Jung in this essay really wants to see ego as the conscious part of the personality or the self, not the entire part. And yeah, so let's get into it. And also, my book is falling apart. I don't know why this happens to me. Does that happen to anyone else? Let me know. It happened to a Hegel book I had. It happened to Anthony Kenny's like History of Philosophy. I don't remember the title exactly, but anyway. Okay, investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which require the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a superordinate concept. So the ego is now a part of the self. So it's not, the self is not the ego, not just the ego. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. So ego is the conscious part, but we also have unconscious parts about us. So that's what Jung is going to talk about, how like the unknown parts of us, the unconscious parts of us, the parts that can never be conscious, the parts that aren't yet conscious, those are still impacting our personality or self. And so it's all a part of who we are. And we go to therapy to discover more of that. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of the psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. With this definition, we have described and delimited the scope of the subject. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness since it is capable of indefinite extension. That is really interesting. So you can discover more and more, expanding your consciousness. Empirically, however, it always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which therefore is not related to the ego as the center of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects, those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown in the outer world. The second, the unknown in the inner world. We call this latter territory the unconscious. So basically, sometimes we might feel a certain way and we don't understand why we feel that way. And that's probably because something unknown externally to us that we haven't really processed, like maybe stress that's coming from a relationship and we just haven't made the connection, or it might be some psychic kind of thing that's going on within us that we need to unpack, like maybe false beliefs that we've had since childhood. And so it's hard to change the way we feel sometimes unless we if we don't understand these either external or or um the internal. The ego as a specific content of consciousness is not a simple or elementary factor, but a complex one, which as such cannot be described exhaustively. Experience shows that it rests on two seemingly different bases, the somatic and the psychic. The somatic basis is inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which for their part are already of a psychic nature and are associated with the ego and are therefore conscious. They are produced by endosomatic stimuli, only some of which cross the threshold of consciousness. I think that's a really interesting idea, the threshold of consciousness. A considerable proportion of these stimuli occur unconsciously, that is, subliminally. The fact that they are subliminal does not necessarily mean that their status is merely physiological, any more than this would be true of a psychic content. Sometimes they are capable of crossing the threshold, that is, of becoming perceptions. But there is no doubt that a large proportion of these endosomatic stimuli are simply incapable of consciousness and are so elementary that there is no reason to assign them a psychic nature. Unless, of course, one favors the philosophical view that all life processes are psychic anyway. The chief objection to this hardly demonstrable hypothesis is that it enlarges the concept of the psyche beyond all bounds and interprets the life process in a way not absolutely warranted by the facts. Concepts that are too broad usually prove to be unsuitable instruments because they are too vague and nebulous. I have, therefore, suggested that the term psychic will be used only where there is evidence of a will capable of modifying reflex or instinctual processes. Here I must refer the reader to my paper on the nature of the psyche, where I have discussed this definition of the psychic at somewhat greater length. I have read that. I don't exactly remember what he says. I think I have read it. Is that the first on psychic energy? On the nature of the psyche. Oh no, I read on psychic energy. Similar title, different. The somatic basis of the ego consists then of conscious and unconscious factors. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other, on the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into three groups. First, temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, such as memory. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. Third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. And this is what I like about Jung. He tells you when there's a limit to certainty. It is a logical inference from the facts underlying Group 2. It contains contents which have not yet erupted into consciousness or which never will. When I said that ego rests on the total field of consciousness, I do not mean that it consists of this. Were that so, it would be indistinguishable from the field of consciousness as a whole. The ego is only the latter's point of reference, grounded on and limited by the somatic factor described above. Although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. It is even acquired, empirically speaking, during the individual's lifetime. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment. And once established as a subject, it goes on developing from further collisions with the outer world and the inner. So as we develop and grow, we're constantly figuring out our inner world, figuring out our outer world, and adjusting. Despite the unlimited extent of its bases, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could, theoretically at least, be described completely. But this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown or unconscious to the subject would be missing. So and a total picture would have to include these. So you're on a first date with someone, you're trying to articulate yourself to them, help them get to know you, you're trying to get to know them. And of course, there's a limit, right? You're just spending a couple of hours together probably. But even if you continue the relationship, you can only explain and articulate what you are conscious of concerning yourself. There's always going to be parts that are unknown and unconscious. And those also have to do with your personality. I saw this Instagram reel that might have come from TikTok. I don't know, I think most of them do, where she said that the girl in the video said that she just realized that her entire personality was a trauma response. And so basically, she's becoming aware of all that, or a lot that has been unconscious, maybe traumatic aspects from your childhood that then go dormant, or sort of, continue coping strategies that don't really work as an adult, but they're still influencing you. And just like when your eyes are opened to this, like different false beliefs, like I realize that I don't feel safe in my body, or I feel that it's not safe to be seen, so you might be going along as an adult acting in certain ways, habitual ways that don't necessarily work for you, but you just can't figure out why. And so, but it's definitely a part of your personality. I mean, this girl said it was like her whole personality, but I think, that was really the point. The unconscious is coming conscious. Okay, where was I? Oh. But a total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible. So you can never explain to your date all that you are, right? But they might be able to see some things that you don't. Because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively, this unconscious portion, as experience has abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with outside help, your therapist or life coach. Clearly, then, the personality as a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego, that is, with the conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the fact of the unconscious. But for a psychology, the distinction is of paramount importance. Even for jurisprudence, it should be of some importance whether certain psychic facts are conscious or not, For instance, in judging the question of responsibility. I have suggested calling the total personality, which, though present, cannot be fully known, the self. So, know thyself, not super easy. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part to the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. By this, I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well-known psychological fact of free choice, or rather the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with the necessity in the outside world, also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. So, like Jean-Paul Sartre, has this sort of idea, this existential idea that you can have inner freedom, you can be truly free, even if your external world imprisons you. His partner, Simone de Beauvoir, pushed against this and said, not exactly, because the external world, the embodiment as we navigate through the actual real world, affects our inner world. And Jung is adding that something that's already within our inner world, maybe not like a present circumstance exactly, but like a past circumstance, collectively and personally, can also limit. I think about the verse of Paul in Romans 7. I do not understand what I do. What I want to do, I do not do, and what I hate, I do. So I wake up in the morning, I really want to start reading, but I can't, and I don't understand why. I have all this time, don't really have anything to do. I could, start my reading, but then it's 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, it's 5 o'clock in the day, and I haven't read anything. So I want to, why can't I do what I want to do? So, I might start consciously trying to figure it out. I'm just not motivated. I just don't want to. I have like this block that I don't understand. And if I can't understand it, it's hard to solve it, perhaps, unless I start doing like affirmations, stuff like that. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego, the self that includes the unconscious, like an objective occurrence which free will can do very little to alter. So, for those of us who have like compulsive behaviors, we know that they're irrational and they're not helping us. We just can't like figure it out. Like we can't get rid of those compulsions. It is indeed well known that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, but is sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development and is greatly altered by them. It is, in the nature of the case, impossible to give any general description of the ego except a formal one. Any other mode of observation would have to take account of the individuality which attaches to the ego as one of its main characteristics. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are, in themselves, everywhere the same, they are infinitely varied as regards clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The rest of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique, and retains the identity up to a certain point. Its stability is relative because far-reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Alterations of this kind need not always be pathological. They can also be developmental and hence fall within the scope of the normal. So someone says, you've changed, you weren't like this, 3 years ago. And then you're like, I know. I don't know what happened. Since it is the point of reference for the fields of consciousness, the ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation, so far as these are achieved by the will. So we try to adapt. We try to progress, but sometimes the inner self, the unconscious, just demands our attention. And Jung says that we then have to stop and sort of regress and do some sort of inner work. My foot is asleep. I don't know why. Okay. The ego, therefore, has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the center of the personality, and that the field of consciousness is the psyche per se. If we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excursions of Carus and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That it is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. It is part of the personality, but not the whole of it. As I have said, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or small its share is, how free or how dependent it is on the qualities of this extra conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. In my experience, one would do well not to underestimate its dependence on the unconscious. Naturally, there is no need to say to this person who already overestimate the latter's importance, some criterion for the right measure is afforded by the psychic consequences of a wrong estimate, a point to which we shall later return. We have seen that, this is the last paragraph. From the standpoint of the psychology of consciousness, the unconsciousness can be divided into three groups of contents. But from the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues. An extra conscious psyche whose contents are personal, and an extra conscious psyche whose contents are impersonal and collective. The first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality and could therefore just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, an omnipresent, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se. This is, of course, no more than a hypothesis, but we are driven to it by the peculiar nature of the empirical material, not to mention the high probability that the general similarity of psychic processes in all individuals must be based on an equally general and impersonal principle that conforms to law, just as the instinct manifesting itself in the individual is only the partial manifestation of an instinctual substrate common to all men. So I used to think, I'm going crazy. We're all so alike, we're all so alike. And Jung helps me understand why that is the case, yet why there is variety for various personalities, right? Because, so what is the empirical evidence that he sees for the collective or impersonal part? So he talks a lot about dreams and how dreams speak in analogies and symbols and archetypes. Then he also looks at the major religions and the mythologies from various cultures and various historical periods, and how, for instance, you have a flood not only in like the Hebrew scriptures, but you also have it in Sumerian, Babylonian mythology, etc. So you have these motifs, and Joseph Campbell talks about it a lot in the Hero with 1,000 Faces, I think it's called, and which I'm currently reading. almost finished. I'm getting close to the end. So if you start doing, like, my PhD is in religion, and so I'm like a comparative religions scholar. And if you start, reading the canonical texts of various major and minor religions and spiritualities, you think, like, the golden rule is in all of these, or you start seeing patterns and motifs and archetypes, like the savior and the villains and the monsters and the tricksters and, the goddess mother of wisdom and etc. And so, a hero's journey, and it all can just make you go a little crazy when you first discover these things, and like, oh no, like I thought that, you know, my religion was special, or these stories were very unique, but there's commonalities and similarities. And so Jung argues that this is because um, we have a collective consciousness. So two cultures that are geographically distanced from each other through time can still, and they never cross over, and they never read each other. They still, like, both have, like, creation and apocalypse and floods and, supernatural deities that punish, or, etc. And so I think it's just really interesting. And yeah, our world, as Jung says in Stages of Life, does not really celebrate or encourage investigation into our unconscious. Not a lot of us know how, I mean, Jung says it's difficult anyway to analyze your own dreams, but not a lot of us, like, even try, or really try to have, like, a dream journal or remember our dreams. He says that not all dreams are meaningful, but sometimes they are. And a lot of the content comes from the unconscious and is symbolized in archetypal ways. So hopefully you enjoyed that. If you have any comments or questions, put them below the video, post them, and I will definitely respond to them. If they're not about the video and just about something random or unsolicited advice, I might delete them. So I just really want, oh, I have, like, lipstick on my teeth. It's just there. All right. That's fine. Um, I'm just, channeling Chapel Rowan and her, like, tiny desk concert. Um, Unintentionally though. So, yeah, so I will see you all next time. Be well and be productive.